This particular program that's on right now, it is very, very intriguing to me personally, because it was during this time period of whenever I first got introduced to the White House in 1983, after making a telephone call that I was going to be the one to meet the Antichrist, and before the poison arrow struck the flesh of my skin, that I would vanish or disappear. That originally, that's whenever I believed that God himself was going to tell Gabriel to blow the trumpet, and that the trumpet was going to blow, and that the Lord Jesus Christ was going to come back in a great cloud, gathering up the elect from the four corners of the earth, pertaining to rapturing the Christian society from the rest of society upon this planet. This was during the time that I was probing the United States because of the severity of what had not only went on with the 75 years of ending Nazism, not only in what had occurred during the JFK administration, in the Cuban standoff, but also in going through these initial stages of realizing that my life had been spared for a particular purpose or reason. This was during the time that I first got introduced to the White House, or the White House got introduced to Juby Jackson, that lived in Northwest Tennessee, after making a telephone call to the White House from my grandmother's house in Kenton, Tennessee, by the name of Lucille Jordan. Please listen to a little bit of the seriousness of all of this, because at that time, people literally thought that the end was upon us, and that just any given moment a drastic tragedy mistake could and was going to occur in the event of starting a nuclear war or a holocaust that would basically be the end of humanity. So please, as you listen to this and watch this, understand that this was very, very troublesome times. During these times of nuclear warfare, and of course today we're living in troublesome times, but our troublesome times today are much different than what they was back then pertaining to the superpowers.
Ronald Reagan's detractors thought he was reckless in the way he poked the Russians, while the superpowers aimed thousands of nuclear weapons at each other. But as we've seen, his most fervent hope was to find a way to eliminate the risk of Armageddon. A year into his first term, he floated a proposal that stunned friend and foe alike.
The human spirit must be capable of rising above dealing with other nations and human beings by threatening their existence.
March 23, 1983. 2 weeks after Reagan dubbed the Soviet Union the evil empire.
Tonight we're launching an effort which holds the promise of changing the course of human history. There will be risks, and the results take time, but I believe we can do it.
One of Ronald Reagan's friends was a scientist who was here.
I want to stop real quick and just reflect and tell you that whenever that automobile rolled over on top of me was just about the time that all these occurrences was taking place. I knew that two hands had miraculously come out of heaven that basically spared my life, in addition to Dr. in Martin, Tennessee, that helped to do a 9-unit blood transfusion after taking out my spleen. I knew that my life had been spared and saved. I just didn't know for sure why. That's whenever I went through this reinventing learning process out of the Bible pertaining to end-time biblical Bible prophecies. That's whenever I was introduced to the White House.
the Hoover Institution, Edward Teller, who began telling the president about the possibility of a strategic defense that could actually defend the United States from incoming ballistic missiles. These things go up into space, and before they come down and re-enter the atmosphere, you can knock them off course or destroy them.
Reagan's idea was dismissed immediately as Star Wars by critics who said it would never work. What I could perceive in the press corps was kind of like, this is a pipe dream.
I have to say that I, for one, didn't understand what a big deal this was, how much President Reagan believed in it. I think a lot of people thought this was just a political tool to say, no, I really don't want nuclear war.
But some believed Reagan was actually risking nuclear war by upending the delicate balance that had thus far prevented Armageddon.
The working military doctrine was mutual assured destruction. MAD. If one side launched a first strike, the other side would have enough nuclear weapons to launch a devastating second strike. Ronald Reagan never felt comfortable with this because it rested entirely on keeping the Soviets scared enough so that they wouldn't do anything catastrophic. It was not a genuine defense.
It seemed SDI was a big focus for them.
Well, if you can defend yourself against ballistic missiles, it changes the whole dynamic of deterrence. Because if I can shoot down your missile, then I don't have to worry about it.
He overturns all of American nuclear policy in several paragraphs, and Ronald Reagan did that on his own initiative, and members of the cabinet were not informed until very shortly before the speech was delivered.
It would not be the last time he surprised them.
My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever.
On August 11th, 1984, he cracked a joke into a mic he didn't know was on.
We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
It was a joke, of course, but its comic premise was based on decades of dead serious Cold War rhetoric.
As we got closer to 1984, people noted the fact that he was going to be the first modern American president to never have sat down with a Russian leader.
Not that Reagan was to blame.
In the first term, people would say, why aren't you negotiating with the then Soviet Union leadership? And Reagan used to say, how can I? They keep dying on me.
They were a bunch of old men, and one followed another to the grave.
Then Gorbachev comes into the picture, who is different in Reagan's eyes and in the eyes of really the world.
Absolutely. You cannot overstate how different Mikhail Gorbachev was from the Russian leaders that had preceded him. There was a sense of a new Soviet leader and new possibilities for engagement.
Gorbachev launched efforts to reform the Soviet Union to make it more open, perestroika and glasnost. When he agreed to meet Reagan in Geneva, Switzerland in November 1985, the world didn't know what to expect. How is the press coverage of that, considering all the anti-communist and evil empire stuff up until then?
There was a sense that the Soviets were on the offensive, and questions about whether the United States could respond. Clearly, Mikhail Gorbachev was a different kind of Russian leader, blazing new paths and building new bridges to the West. Could Reagan keep up with Gorbachev?
He's younger, he's smarter, he's better read, he's traveled more to the West, he's more willing to engage in argument, but he's also the last true believer.
A true believer in Marxist-Leninist ideology that still held communism would bury the West. And while Soviet Central Casting may have ordered up a new style leader, the wardrobe department didn't get the memo.
Gorbachev pulls up, and although he's the younger man by quite a bit, Gorbachev looks older. He's wearing an extremely heavy Russian overcoat, and he looks grim and defensive and old.
Suddenly, Reagan comes out, but he's just wearing a beautifully tailored suit.
No overcoat, no hat, no wool scarf.
The Soviet system produces a leader who, although much younger, looks older. And the American system produces a leader who, although much older, is far more full of life. And that image goes out around the world.
The old man who, as I said, people were doubting, could he keep up with Gorbachev? Suddenly he had, in effect, stolen the first scene. Point Reagan.
Away from the cameras, Gorbachev was ready to play hardball.
Gorbachev doesn't come to Geneva ready to say, well, look, I think we Soviets have made a terrible mistake. Let's just wrap up this Cold. Not at all. The first thing he wants to do is push.
He pushed especially hard against SDI, claiming its true aim was not defensive but offensive, an effort to neutralize any Soviet weapons and render them helpless against a U.S. attack.
Reagan said to Gorbachev, you can't win this Cold War. And Gorbachev says, why do you say that? And Reagan says, because we will outspend you every time. People always ask me later about Reagan at that moment. Did he really think that there's going to be an end to the Soviet Union? And I always said yes, because I really thought this was going to change. And he just hoped it was on his watch.
Two leaders, two different views of the Cold War. Reagan knew in his gut that the Soviet Union was flimsy and would eventually crumble. The Marxist Gorbachev fervently believed communism would ultimately prevail, but at least they were at the table. Their first conversation lasting longer than any of the aides anticipated. Did you want to interrupt?
There's always some guy in the White House whose job it is to go and stand obnoxiously in order to get the message time is up. So he comes around to me and he says, "Sir, I go in." The longer they spend together, the better it is.
The second thing that happens is Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan recognize in each other human beings. So there's some basic human connection between those two men that gets made at Geneva and from which everything else follows.
Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to meet again in Reykjavik, Iceland.
We had no idea what was going to happen there. Gorbachev came, as it turned out, with a whole menu of items that had been non-negotiable.
Indeed, the Soviet leader stunned American negotiators with his willingness to give up several classes of missiles they'd long hoped to eliminate.
Gorbachev lays on the table practically all our negotiating positions. It was astonishing. At one point, Reagan started to interrupt. I put my hand in his arm. No, just let him talk. He's coming our way.
Gorbachev kept coming. He boldly proposed getting rid of nukes altogether. But there was a catch. Reagan had to give up Star Wars.
Suddenly, the whole nuclear arsenal was on the table. If, Mr. President, you will get rid of SDI.
Here in America, we were being castigated by every corner for wanting Star Wars. Meanwhile, Gorbachev was willing to give away his entire nuclear arsenal if we would give up Star Wars.
Reagan said niet.
Reykjavik, the big moment is that they realize they can't reach an agreement on those terms.
Ultimately, the talks fell apart because Reagan wouldn't.
Reagan's friends and foes alike saw it as a colossal blunder. Given the chance to perhaps start to rid the nations of all nuclear weapons, Reagan opted instead to cling to his Star Wars dream, SDI. Even Reagan wasn't sure he'd done the right thing.
It took a few hours, and then George Shultz realized this was actually a breakthrough, even though that agreement broke down. Look at all the Soviets have put on the table. And once you put something on the table, you can't really take it back. And furthermore, Gorbachev is now able to go back to Moscow and say to the hardliners, I went nose to nose with him, and he would not give us the agreement we needed. At that moment, both sides realize it's done. They don't quite figure out what's going to come next, but they know the old game has ended.
And Reagan would underscore that in front of the Berlin Wall.
Limp.
She marched.
She wrote.
She demanded. In 1987, the 750th anniversary of Berlin, Germany invited world leaders to the city to mark the occasion. Reagan saw an opportunity to challenge Gorbachev from communism's most symbolic platform, the Berlin Wall.
The Berlin Wall.
Now keep in mind, whenever Gorbachev first come onto the scene, in the Christian society world over here in the Western world, all kinds of gossip started floating around about Gorbachev's birthmark on his head, towards it actually being a symbol of the Antichrist, as far as Gorbachev having a mark either on his back of his hand or his forehead. And because he had this mark on his forehead, people was adding two and two together, like this was going to be the actual Antichrist that was going to come onto the scene. But also keep in mind that it was only through the perseverance of teaching of the Bible, of end time events, that helped to eliminate part of the threat in 1980 and 8, in identifying that yes, biblical Bible prophecy was prophesied to occur, and that the world was not going to be destroyed by a nuclear bomb or a Holocaust, but it was going to be destroyed the way that the Bible had predicted for it to be destroyed. It was a president or two before Gorbachev, I think it was Brezhnev, that made a statement that we would take the American people over and never fire a shot. It was to their appeal of bringing down our own personal democracy in our own Achilles heel by thinking that they could outmaneuver, outspend, outweigh, and outdo the American government. But it was because of Ronald Reagan and God the Father pertaining to the Holy Spirit, and yes, 9 tapes that wound up going to the White House, that sealed the deal that the Cold War had officially now ended over in Russia, to the point that we could start transferring goods from America to Russia. We could start transferring goods from Russia to America, and vice versa. They would be on the global, international market pertaining to the fair trade market that was exploding at that time all over the world. Once more, pertaining to FEMA, no one said nothing to no one about fair trade. They was just talking about free trade. Free trade, free trade, free trade. But what about fair trade? And we didn't realize during this movement that was breaking down barriers of ending the Cold War, that was actually creating barriers that has put us subsequently where we are today in regards towards a lot of our factories and a lot of our workload did in fact go south, because basically at that point in time we was being undercut in the labor force communities in other parts of the world, towards them basically doing the exact same job for a fourth and sometimes even cheaper than what we could produce the same product over here in America. So whenever we opened up to a global community, we was opening ourselves up for a great fall in the economical standpoint of being the #1 country of the world at that time. George, #1 in agriculture, #1 in goods, #1 in medical, #1 in the smokestack industry, #1 in almost everything imaginable that you could think of. America was #1. So as you're listening to this, keep in mind of the traits that followed in behind these events that has put us where we are now.
The barricade that more vividly than a purge illustrates the failure of communism. Never a day passes along the bumbling barricade without at least one break for freedom. Expressions of man's determination to defy tyranny in any form.
One of the things that I think made Reagan a historical figure was he had this uncanny ability to catch the crest of change in history. The Berlin speech is a good example.
Peter Robinson was assigned to draft Reagan's remarks.
I went over to West Berlin, as we called it in those days, to do some research. First stop is at the Berlin Wall. And over here is the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Standing there, if you close your eyes, you could almost hear the incoming shell fire from the Battle of Berlin. You can still feel the horrors of the Second World War. And then you open your eyes and you can see the free world and turn and look at the communist world.
In West Berlin, where democracy rules, these pictures speak for themselves. The citizens, well clad, walk freely. East Berlin, too, reveals itself to the camera. Citizenry stealthy, streets empty. Drab is the word that describes its scenes.
It's color and gray. It's motion and nothingness.
Nervous West German officials appealed to the White House to pick another location. They worried Reagan might provoke Gorbachev. Reagan's own State Department worried too.
I paid a visit on the ranking American diplomat in West Berlin, and he was full of ideas about what Ronald Reagan should not say. Don't have Ronald Reagan come here and sound like some anti-communist cowboy. And don't make a big deal out of the wall. They've gotten used to it now.
Maybe the government had, but Robinson discovered the German people had not.
In the evening, I went out to a residential suburb, still in West Berlin, where I met about a dozen or 15 Germans. I said, "Is it true? Have you gotten used to the wall?" One man raised his arm and pointed and said, "My sister lives just a few kilometers in that direction, but I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. How do you think we feel about the wall?" They hadn't gotten used, they had stopped talking about it.
One woman crystallized for Robinson the speech he wanted to write.
Ingeborg Eltz, lovely woman, but she became angry and said, if this man Gorbachev is serious with this talk, glasnost, perestroika, if he's serious, he can come here and take down that wall.
Robinson found that positively Reagan-esque. So did Reagan.
Back I went to the White House and built a speech around this call to tear down the wall. I said, Mr. President, I learned in Berlin that on the communist side of the wall, they'll be able to hear the speech as well. Is there anything in particular you want to say to people on the other side, the communist side of the wall? And Ronald Reagan thought for a moment, and then he said, well, there's that passage about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to come down.
Other Reagan aides tried to kill the line.
There were several objections. One was that it just didn't sound right to the foreign policy apparatus. And part of it was the concern that by naming Gorbachev personally, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That would put Gorbachev in a difficult position with his own Politburo.
Plus, the world had come to admire Gorbachev as a man of peace. Reagan was still widely seen as a warmonger. This wouldn't help. And wouldn't Reagan be raising false expectations?
You don't call for tearing down a wall that's permanent. Who knew when that wall would come down? It certainly wasn't going to be anytime soon, and probably not in our lifetime.
He didn't know how or when, but he just felt it was coming, and it was time for him to speak up.
So Reagan kept the line, telling an aide, the boys at State are going to kill me, but it's the right thing to do.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
He was a man of commitment, a vision, a purpose. He knew it needed to be said in that way, at that place, at that time, and it was truly a moment of destiny. And when you look at what could have not happened had he not said that, the world forever may have been a different place.
This much is certain. Reagan, again, read the situation much more sagely than the foreign policy experts. Gorbachev didn't walk away from the negotiation table. 6 months after Berlin, he came to Washington to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, which would lead to the elimination of nuclear and conventional missiles within a few years. Famously on that trip, Gorbachev surprised and charmed Americans when he jumped out of his limo and waded into a throng of admirers. But Reagan would have his own surprise when the two leaders would meet for their last summit for 3 days in Moscow.
We love our new home. There's so much space.
We have a guest.
As Reagan entered his last year in office, even some of his doubters conceded he'd understood the Cold War better than they did.
I think along the way, the president was clearly underestimated. One had a sense that he had the upper hand in his relationship with the Soviets, that he had gotten the intermediate range missiles not only out of Europe, but out of the whole world. They were basically arguing on his agenda, that he was setting the terms, not Mikhail Gorbachev, not the Russians, and that was quite different from what it had been when he came into office.
But nobody, including Reagan, could know how close he was to pushing the Soviet Empire to collapse.
Didn't know at that point that he was going to win the Cold War. Moscow was still very much a superpower and very much, at least in armaments, the equal of the United States.
And there were whispers, plenty of them, that Reagan, now 77 years old, had lost his edge. So what to expect from his last summit with Gorbachev? 3 days in Moscow. Great theater, at the very least.
The trip to Moscow wrote itself. The great Cold Warrior Ronald Reagan in the heart of the evil empire, literally in Red Square. So you knew this was going to be very special.
I distinctly remember President Reagan getting on Marine One, and somebody yells a question, what are you hoping for? And he says something like, sometimes the final act is the best act.
You got it. But you also have to know when to leave center stage.
That's right. That's right.
That's his other line that he used to use. Well, the Moscow summit came sort of toward the end. It was kind of a summation type summit. But yet, Reagan was always true to his beliefs.
Reagan truly believed this much, that for all the talk about glasnost and perestroika, Gorbachev was kidding himself if he thought he could reform the Soviet Union into a free, equal, and economically productive society. He also sensed that even though the Soviet leaders were not ready for real change, the Soviet people were. And he intended to make his case to them.
It seemed clear the president really wanted to send a message, not just to America, but to the Russian people as well, that we really care about you and we really want to see your lives change.
That began day one.
Nancy says Ronnie wants to go for a walk among the people. There's a commercial area right near the embassy, half a block away, called the Arbat. The Secret Service says, well, we don't think we should do it. They pointed out that the leaders there don't just go walking in crowds, even though Gorbachev did it in America. And Mrs. Reagan says, we're going to do it, and we want to do it in 15 minutes.
And off they went. When the stunned Russians realized the American president was in their midst, pandemonium ensued.
The Secret Service says, that's it, we're gone. They grabbed the president and headed back for the embassy. And Helen Thomas was right behind Mrs. Reagan.
Helen Thomas, the UPI correspondent who played the role of gadfly throughout Reagan's 2 terms.
Suddenly a KGB guy reached in and shoved her, and Helen started to go down. Mrs. Reagan turned around and grabbed Helen and said, come with me. We went in the door, and Mrs. Reagan said, well, Marlon, what do you think of that? And I thought, well, we just missed our last best chance to get rid of Helen Thomas. But in terms of the president making his point, it was golden.
On day 2, Reagan went on another walk, this time through Red Square with Gorbachev.
There was a metaphor for the extraordinary journey that Reagan had taken personally and the journey that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had taken in terms of their relations.
It turned out to be the high point of the summit because it wasn't scripted. There were people around there with kids, and Reagan was saying hello, and it was very informal and nice.
And not nearly as chaotic as the Arbat, perhaps because, as Fitzwater whispered to Reagan, many of those regular Russians were apparently KGB operatives. A reporter asked the big question Reagan surely knew was coming.
Do you still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President?
No. He said that was another time and another era, and put his arm around Gorbachev. Oh my gosh. As a newsman, it doesn't get any better than that.
He wanted to do that walk to say, I no longer believe it's the evil empire. I believe they're good people who want a better life.
But had Reagan's mind really changed? Certainly not as much as the Soviet leadership had hoped. Mikhail Gorbachev was going to learn that on the climactic third day in Moscow. Say the Geneva summit, when Reagan and Gorbachev first met face to face and erected the scaffolding of their future negotiations. Others named Reykjavik because the two sides had reached agreements on important points they could not take back. Still others point to the Washington summit, not only because that was where an actual treaty had been signed, but because it had enhanced the relationship and friendship between the two men and their nations. In my book, I say it may have been a culmination of all of that in the Moscow summit. Its timing, its tone, its moral achievement. Those 3 days in Moscow did more than anything to squarely present the choice the world was facing. And what made the summit truly transcendent was Reagan's speech at Moscow State University.
It's not surprising that Ronald Reagan would choose to go to a university. He believed here in America that everything rested on the next generation. That was important to him, not to ignore young people, but to really engage them.
The speech at Moscow University, where the president wanted to talk about freedom of speech.
Set the stage for that one.
When I walked in the door, I looked up, and to the head of the church was this huge statue of Lenin, and the lectern that was set up for Reagan was right in front of it.
You're thinking that's a bad thing?
I'm thinking it's a horrible thing, yes. And President Reagan was smiling. And what I didn't get was President Reagan saw it as an opportunity
to deliver this message.
To deliver this
freedom,
yes,
under Lenin's
eye. His joke later was, how great was it to have Lenin map to stare at my backside for an hour and a half? But it turned out to be a perfect forum for him to deliver his message.
The students filed in and settled down. Reagan warmed up his audience by wishing them success in their own language.
I know you must be very busy this week, studying and taking your final examinations. So let me just say, Желаю вам успеха. We Americans make no secret of our belief in freedom. Go into any schoolroom, and there you will see children being taught the Declaration of Independence, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that no government can justly deny.
He spoke to them as if they were bound together in a common destiny.
I have often said, nations do not distrust each other because they are armed. They are armed because they distrust each other. Peace between nations must be an enduring goal, not a tactical stage in a continuing conflict.
As they listened, the students witnessed the rhetorical gift that Americans had long appreciated, his utter authenticity, The words more convincing because they were spoken from the heart.
America is a nation made up of hundreds of nationalities. Our ties to you are more than ones of good feeling. They're ties of kinship. They come from every part of this vast continent, from every continent to live in harmony, seeking a place where each cultural heritage is respected, each is valued for its diverse strengths and beauties, and the richness it brings to our lives.
I think the big...
Exactly. And that was the ideal, that was the vision, that was the dream. And then in 1989, I pursued those ideals and those dreams. And I was stopped by the government itself in 1989 down in Madison County that decided that they wasn't just going to intervene in trying to stop a ministry, but that they was going to take something that was crucial to the ministry, which was the sword symbolizing peace on earth. And that's where my story kicks in regards to all of this. But once more, the government did intervene. They intervened in my dream, my ideal. They intervened in the anointing that I felt placed upon my life in 1988, that engaged in not only 9 tapes that went to the White House, but it engaged in the pursuit towards me endeavoring towards putting out the message as a messenger to the general public. And of course, if anybody knows anything about my story, they know that I had hardship and I had obstacles that the devil had placed purposely in front of me so that I would have to either go around or go over. And it was all in the fact of trying to hamper, slow down, or even, yes, stop the Windmill Ministries from succeeding. Which once more has put us in a very, very precarious state of where we are today in 2020.
Difference. The big turning point in that speech is that up to that point, the president had talked in a negative sense about the Soviet Union, about what they didn't have. And in that speech, the president held out the hope for what you could have, that people in Russia wanted freedom, religious freedom, political freedom, human rights, just like people all over the world did.
In this Moscow spring, this May 1988, we may be allowed that hope. That freedom, like the fresh green sapling planted over Tolstoy's grave, will blossom forth at last in the rich, fertile soil of your people and culture. Thank you all very much, and da blagoslavit, da Gospod, God bless you.
Once more, he was talking about the month of May, finalizing that deal. It was March the 22nd was whenever I actually obtained my spiritual crown, and it was shortly after March was whenever the 9 tapes got sent to the White House, all in conjunction towards biblical Bible prophecy unveiling and revealing itself to some of the greatest leaders here in America that America had ever produced since its existence, going all the way back to 1775. Thanks again for listening. Good luck to all of us is all we can say here at the Windmill Ministries at 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255. And God bless America, and God bless our endeavors of those who are seeking a righteous, better way of life to not only to benefit and to glorify our heavenly Maker through His Son Jesus Christ, but to also benefit each other in these endeavors. Thanks again, and once more, shalom.